In this week's Parsha, we learn about an obligation to bless Hashem while eating. Bachata v'savata u'barachta. This is an obligation mid'araisa, obligation minha-Torah. According to the Ramban and many poskim, there's another bracha that is likewise also obligatory minha-Torah, and that is the Birchas HaTorah, the bracha that we make while learning. So there's two brachas that are obligatory minha-Torah. Birchas HaMazon, the bracha on food, and Birchas HaTorah, and the bracha on the Torah. There's an obvious contrast and differentiation, however, between these two brachas, as the Gemara, Daf Chaches Brachas differentiates, and that is the obligation minha-Torah to bless Hashem while eating is after we eat. Bachata v'savata, you should eat and be satisfied, and then uberachta. The bracha minha-Torah while learning is before we learn. So we have two brachas that are obligatory minha-Torah. One, the obligation is after the experience, and one, the obligation is before the experience. This differentiation is even more highlighted with the following ideas developed in the Gemara, Daf Chaches over there, and also Daf Membeches. And that is, we know there's also a chiyuv to bless Hashem before we eat. Brachas Hana. It's an obligation that's familiar to us and we practice daily. However, this obligation, the Gemara says there's no clear instruction, there's no clear pasuk for it, but rather we learn it misvara, we learn it logically. Logic dictates that we should bless Hashem before we eat. Likewise, there is another obligation to bless Hashem after we learn. Now, of course, we don't usually practice this. We don't make a bracha after we learn. But that is because, as the Beis Yosef and the Paiskim explain, we never finish our obligation of learning. We basically never finish learning. We do actualize this theoretical obligation in Kriyas HaTorah B'tzibur. In a public reading of the Torah, every Oila, when he finishes his Aliyah, makes a Birchas HaTorah la'achareh, a Birchas HaTorah after the finishing of the learning. Again, the Gemara says we learn this from logic. So logic dictates that we should make a bracha before we eat and after we learn. After we eat and before we learn, that's not logical. That we need a clear instruction. That we need a clear pasuk, a clear word of Hashem. Logically, we would know that we have to bless Hashem before we eat and after we learn. Logic would not dictate, would not obligate us to bless Hashem after we eat and before we learn. What is the meaning behind this differentiation, behind this contrast? And it's clear that the differentiation and the meaning behind this differentiation goes to the heart of the difference between the experience of eating and the pursuit of pleasurable activities and the experience of learning and the pursuit of activities which are bigger and higher than us. And that is before we eat, or participate in pleasurable activities, we don't need to motivate ourselves for that. It's instinctive. Indeed, we feel the physical symptoms of anticipation towards the meal, towards the pleasurable activity. In contrast, before we engage in something bigger and better than us and higher than us, we don't feel that anticipation. We feel instead the inertia, the difficulty of getting up and doing what we know is right. We don't feel lucky at that point. We feel an obligation. Therefore, before we eat, when we feel that excitement and anticipation, it's logical that we should have to turn that anticipation into a blessing to Hashem. Before we learn, where we don't feel lucky, where we feel the obligation, it isn't logical that we have to bless Hashem at that point. For that, we need a clear instruction. In contrast, when we finish learning or we finish that pleasurable activity, it's over. The anticipation is not there. In fact, now we're feeling the physical anticipation as symptoms for the next pleasurable activity. A poor person, a rich, wealthy person who becomes poor, doesn't take pleasure in his past luxurious life. Only because he knows he could do it again does he take pleasure in those memories. But if he knows he can never do it again, those memories are a source of pain for him. And therefore, when we finish eating, it isn't logical that we should have to thank Hashem there, that we should have to blessing. It's not an experience of joy when we finish. And therefore, we need a clear instruction from Hashem that we should bless him when we finish eating. In contrast, when we finish learning, when we finish the experience of pursuing something bigger and higher than us, its challenge of conquering ourselves, we feel that sense of accomplishment. We feel that sense of gratitude for that ability to conquer ourselves, for that ability to connect to something higher and bigger than us. And therefore, logic dictates that at that point, we should thank Hashem. So logic dictates before we eat, when we feel that anticipation. After we learn, when we feel that sense of accomplishment and gratefulness, we should bless Hashem. After we eat, and before we learn, when we're not feeling that excitement, we need a clear instruction. We need a clear word from Hashem. Of course, the value in this idea is to highlight the difference between the experience of pleasurable activities for their own sake and activities that connect us to something bigger and higher than ourselves, that initially seem difficult, that we don't want to do, but have eternal value. But there is another idea that's within this differentiation, that's embedded within this differentiation, and that is the power of benching. The power of benching to flip the script. Benching is supposed to flip the script, where when we finish the meal, we're not just in pursuit of the next meal, but rather we feel gratitude for the experience that we had. Instead of constantly thinking, where do I go next? We take pleasure in past activities, and we use them to connect to Hashem. In fact, the Bartanura says on the Mishnah Perek Avos Perek Gimel, over there in the Mishnah it says that if people are eating a meal and they don't say a Dvar Torah, it says if they ate from a meal that was dedicated to Avodah Zarah, a meal not dedicated to Hashem. The Bartanura says you can fulfill your obligation to say Dvar Torah on the meal with benching. And Tosfos Yontif says that makes no sense. If you can fulfill the obligation with benching, then why would the Tana feel a need to tell us about this? Every Yid benches. Obviously, the Tana is demanding from us something more, that besides the benching, we should say Dvar Torah. Also, benching is happening after the meal, not during the meal. But the Chadush Harim and others say, no. If you bench with kavanah, with intention and awareness, that's not so simple. If you bench with intention and awareness and gratefulness, you have transformed your meal into a meal a meal dedicated to Hashem. And that is the instruction of benching. To take that meal that is now over, and that by default we no longer will feel grateful for, and to actively engage in gratefulness for what we experienced. This is strengthened by the idea that Kuzari says for the purpose of brachas. Kuzari in Maimer Shlishi says that what is the purpose of brachas in general? So Amar Chaver, the Chaver says, or Rabbi Levi says, or the Chaver says, Uma shamar ben imus b'chaya chassid. What adds to sweetness in the life of the chassid, umachaska, and makes it strong. But yisler arevus ala revus, and adds sweetness on the sweetness. Who chayvas habrachas is the obligation of brachas. Amar Kuzari. So Rabbi Levi says, like Kuzari says, how you talking about davar? How could that be? For our brachas tirchana sevasam, the brachas are burdensome. It's hard to bench. It's difficult. It's annoying. We're always trying to get around it. Zaynus bagels, Mizanis bread, they don't seem to add pleasure. And the Rabbi Levi answers in the mouth of the chaver, imagine a drunk person who's not aware and he's stuffing food down down his mouth. He's going to take no lasting pleasure in this. Likewise, food, pleasurable activities, vacations, they have no lasting value unless you add to it the chayvas habrachas, the awareness of gratitude for what we had, that awareness and gratitude for that experience. Then it can be lasting. The Gemara in Brachas, Daf Mem Beis, says the following moving story. When Rav passed away, Azlu Talmidim Basrei, his Talmidim went to his Levaya. Ki Hadri, when they returned, Amr Nezel v'nechel lachma, let's go eat bread. As they were sitting to eat the bread, they had a question in the halachas of benching. Kam Rav Ada bar Abba. Rav Ada bar Abba got up. Ahadar kara la'achora. He made another kriya on his clothes. Amar nach nafsheda Rav. Ubirchas mazoina loiger minan. Rav passed away. Our Rebbe passed away, and we haven't finished learning the Birchas Hamazon. This necessitates another kriya. Ada asahu saba, till this old man came and he told them this halacha. Who is this old man? Rabbi Yehuda Chassan Atayson Cholon says this was Eliyahu Hanavi, who saw their desire, their sincere desire to know the halachas of benching, the sincere valuing of what benching means, and therefore they were merited the Gilu Eliyahu through recognizing the value of benching and the merit of benching the Kavanah. May we be all zeicha to the ultimate Gilu Eliyahu with the coming of Mashiach. Good Shabbos.